Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Fractures within the Democratic Party may be reaching a breaking point, imperiling President Biden's domestic agenda. He met with key House Democrats Wednesday in an attempt to smooth things over. But some members of the party think the president's target of $3.5 trillion in climate and social spending are out of the realm of possibility. Meanwhile, the White House is facing criticism over its handling of migrants seeking asylum at the southern border. The administration is chartering flights, deporting Haitians back to their nation in a time of political peril. The nation is still reeling after a severe earthquake and the assassination of their president. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus have called on the White House to suspend the Border Patrol agents who were photographed on horseback rounding up migrants in Del Rio, Texas. Plus, at a virtual COVID-19 summit this morning, President Biden said it was the responsibility of wealthy nations to donate, not sell, doses of the vaccine to the rest of the world. He announced the launch of a vaccination partnership with the European Union and made this commitment.
The United States is buying another 500 million doses of Pfizer to donate to low and middle-income countries around the world. This is another 500 million doses that will all be shipped by this time next year. And it brings our total commitment of donated vaccines to over 1.1 billion vaccines to be donated. Put another way, for every one shot we've administered to date in America, we have now committed to do 3 shots to the rest of the world.
And it seems President Biden is patching things up with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron. It comes after a dispute over a nuclear submarine deal between the U.S. and Australia. The White House released this photo of the leaders speaking by phone. They agreed to continue working together toward common objectives. And France says it will return its ambassador to the U.S. Ed O'Keefe, Zeke Miller, and Catherine Lucey join me now. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. And Catherine is a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you all. Catherine, let me start with you. New polling shows 62% of Iowa voters disapprove of President Biden's job performance. The Afghanistan withdrawal numbers were worse. His domestic agenda now looks to be under serious threat. So why are White House officials still saying that they're encouraged?
I think White House officials still see a path forward here on this legislation, although obviously, this is really a crunch moment for the president. And you see that in what they're doing today. He's hosting legislative leaders, key moderates and progressives at the White House today as they try and figure out how to move forward with his domestic agenda and these 2 really massive bills on both traditional infrastructure and social spending. So you're seeing that play out today. They really think that there is a way to do this, but this is a tough line for the president to walk. And it's going to really test, the kind of campaign he ran and the fact that he ran as someone who could bridge divides in the party, who had legislative experience to work with both sides of the aisle, and that he was someone who could deliver on big promises. And to go back to the beginning of your question, in terms of, polling in places like Iowa and some of these moderate locations, they really think that the best thing they can do going into the midterms is to show that they can deliver on some of these promises. So that is the goal here, is to really be able to tell voters in key congressional districts that the president was able to bridge divides and work with work with his party and also work in a bipartisan way across party lines to deliver things for voters.
Well, Ed, there are calls to shrink the size of the president's $3.5 trillion spending proposal coming from some members of the president's own party. Who's leading those calls?
Yeah, this is interesting. A memo that was sent today to all congressional Democratic offices by John Podesta, former White House chief of staff who ran Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, runs the Center for American Progress, essentially a centrist Democratic Party think tank, saying it to all these members, look, the $3.5 trillion price tag you're talking about is going to have to come down a little bit if you expect this to get through. But he's also saying to to moderate Democrats who may only favor doing the bipartisan infrastructure plan because of its size and scope, no, you got to do both. Writing to them, you're either getting both bills or neither, and the prospect of neither is unconscionable. Now, Why should they be taking cues from John Podesta? They don't necessarily need to. But he has a good sense of the politics of this, pointing out to them, look, your party's on the verge of losing seats next year in the midterms. It could lose even more if you don't get this done. So please, for the sake of party unity, for the sake of our political future, for the sake of the country and the economy, get together, figure this out, and put together a plan that can pass. And that's part of what's going on here at the White House as we speak. The president met earlier today with the House Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader. He's wrapping up a meeting with moderates in both chambers, and then he's having the liberals over in a little bit to talk about their concerns. After all those meetings, the hope is that he and congressional leadership can sort of see where the similarities and differences lie and try to get that legislation moving. With a 43% approval rating in a Gallup poll, the White House understands that if his domestic agenda is in peril, those numbers could get worse. But, as Catherine pointed out, they remain confident because at least all the sides are still talking.
Well, Zeke, the Senate is poised to vote on a temporary spending bill to fund the government and extend its borrowing ability. Here's what Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said about raising the debt ceiling earlier today.
My advice to this Democratic government, the President, the House, and the Senate, don't play Russian roulette with our economy. Step up and raise the debt ceiling to cover all that you've been engaged in all year long. So no effort on their part to describe our position as irresponsible makes any sense, because the facts are indisputable. This is a totally Democratic government. They have an obligation to raise the debt ceiling, and they will do it.
Zeke, which party has the most to lose if this bill fails?
Because they're in power, the president and the Democratic Party certainly have the most at stake here. Some of this is, with great power comes great responsibility, to put Spider-Man there. But ultimately, President Biden ran on a ticket. He was elected on the promise that he could bring back sort of a sense of normalcy in Washington, and a government shutdown or a fight over the debt limit, a potential default of the full faith and credit of the United States in the first year of his term with unified Democratic control of Washington would certainly not be good for him. Is he truly responsible at the end of the day, as Mitch McConnell is trying to say? No, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. The debt that was rung up, a lot of it was run up under Republican presidents, passed by Republican Congresses. There's all those sorts of nuances, but politics are politics, and that's why Mitch McConnell's drawing that line in the sand there. He's very good at that as a tactical politician. He's betting that his members will be able to exploit one way or the other this issue come the fall of 2022, and then the White House will be left holding the bag. That may just be the political reality that Joe Biden is facing right now.
All right, switching gears, Ed, we all remember those protests, not just in Washington, D.C., but really across the country in the wake of the killing of George Floyd by police. Now it looks like any sort of federal reform is increasingly unlikely. Here is some of your exchange today with White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
Democratic negotiators on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act say the bipartisan talks are dead. Is that the view of the White House? Is there any response to this announcement that it's apparently over?
I would say that first, the president and everyone in the administration, we have been strongly supportive of Senator Booker and Representative Bass in their efforts, and we're greatly appreciative of their efforts, which we consider to be ongoing. Unfortunately, Republicans rejected reforms that even the previous president had supported and refused to engage on key issues that many in law enforcement were willing to address. And so we are disappointed. The president is disappointed.
So, Ed, what happened, and then what happens next?
Well, according to people we've spoken to, essentially, it was, again, the arguments over qualified immunity, or what happens to police officers, whether they can be held liable for incidents of wrongdoing. Democrats have circulated some of the things they were pushing for example, insisting that there be banning the use of no-knock warrants on all drug cases, making evidence seized in violation of the policy inadmissible in court, dropping the militarization of police forces by not allowing them to use or to purchase old military equipment for their use. And the Democrats say, look, we went to the Republicans again on this week. We worked with the police unions, as was our goal all summer long, to get an agreement. We got one, and the Republicans said no. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the lead GOP negotiator, turned around and said, look, Democrats said no because they couldn't let go of their push to defund our law enforcement. Once again, the left let their misguided idea of perfect be the enemy of good, impactful legislation. So essentially the two camps are back where they were when this all began. Let's try to make changes, the Democrats say. Republicans arguing, we're willing to make some changes, but you can't so-called defund the police. Although you talk to most Democrats these days, they'll tell you they're not looking to defund the police. They're looking to rewrite the budgets and the priorities. And it seems as if there will not be an agreement, at least in a bipartisan sense. The president put out a statement after that exchange with the White House press secretary to say he's going to work with lawmakers who are willing to make these changes. He's going to go back to the Justice Department and his lawyers here to see what other executive actions he might be able to take absent congressional work.
All right, I know a lot of folks are paying close attention to that, but really those were the issues that seemed to be the main sticking points all along, namely that qualified immunity, something that we know from the very beginning we understood to be the point at which there really was not a lot of wiggle room, and it appears all these weeks and months later that still remains the case. We'll continue to watch that. Meantime, Catherine, the White House is fielding increasingly vocal bipartisan criticism about migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border, specifically Haitians. What is the White House doing on that front?
That's right. I mean, they're facing criticism from both sides of the aisle. They've been deporting some of these migrants, allowing others to stay, and that's really led to pretty widespread criticism. And one of the things to think about here is, this moment, this surge of migrants is really testing the president's promise of a more welcoming immigration policy. Now, some experts we talked to say he doesn't have a lot of great options right now. He also doesn't have a lot of political support. The administration is worried that if they don't take any action here, more migrants will come to the border. But as you noted earlier in the show, some of these images of patrol agents clashing with migrants have drawn really serious criticism. And civil rights groups are accusing the president of breaking his promise to be more humane on immigration. At that briefing today that I was at, the press secretary said that the president does want a more humane policy, but says he needs Congress to act. They're defending the use of a Trump-era, public health policy to expel migrants. And on the other side of the aisle, Republicans are arguing that the president isn't being tough enough on immigration, and that some of his early rhetoric might have sort of fueled some of this surge of people to the border. So this remains a really thorny issue for the president. These are very complicated issues, and they have a long way to go to work this out.
Yeah, it's an issue that has long bedeviled other presidents. Zeke, President Biden's deadline for federal agencies to submit their ideas for boosting voter participation is tomorrow. He signed an executive order on that back in March. What are you hearing?
We're expecting some modest proposals from some federal agencies, but it's not really clear how much that's going to move the needle. Voting at the end of the day, is not traditionally a federal issue outside of the civil rights realm. It's a state and local issue, and there are some ideas that come out of the federal level, but they're not likely to. But without legislation, there's really not a whole lot the federal government can do, and this sort of fits in the same bucket like immigration, like police reform, and some of the other issues we've talked about, where the president's finding himself as he and his party have tried to push through a whole number of sort of voting reforms to try to make it easier to vote. He found himself sort of stymied by Congress and by impasses on Capitol Hill. These executive actions that they're trying to put forward are sort of an effort around that, but they're sort of limited in scope and in capacity and what they can actually get done through it. It's just in a way, this reports tomorrow will sort of be a reminder of just sort of the gulf between sort of the aspirations that President Biden entered Washington with, 8-9 months ago, of trying to make it easier to vote, make it easier to pass police reform, all those other issues, and then the crushing reality of a divided Washington and log jams on Capitol Hill, even with Democrats controlling both chambers of Congress.
Crushing reality indeed. Quickly, Ed, I want to ask you about what's shaping up to be almost a proxy fight here. Former President Trump has been actively working to oust Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who voted for his impeachment. The Wall Street Journal reports former President Bush is coming to Cheney's defense. How?
Yes, and Catherine's newspaper got it. We got it, too. There's an invitation to a fundraiser he'll hold for his former State Department official, she worked for him in the Bush administration in Dallas in a few days, a sign that, yes, there's a proxy battle the size of Wyoming underway in the Republican Party between those on sort of the Bush-Cheney side of the argument and, of course, the former president who supports other candidates against her, given that she's the most vocal House Republican opposed to what happened on January 6th and his involvement in it, and someone who's spoken out considerably about what he has done and said and not done, excuse me, and not said since January 6th. So the former president obviously willing to engage, willing to, put his name out there as somebody who supports a certain kind of Republican candidate, and that's going to put him at odds yet again with the other former president, Donald Trump. Remember, the former President Bush spoke on 9/11, the 20th anniversary of it, and gave a speech that drew the ire of his former presidential colleague for calling out the concerns about domestic terrorists in this country and they being as dangerous as foreign terrorists. The former President Trump sort of misinterpreted or tried to define more clearly what Bush was saying, suggesting that the former President Bush was talking about conservatives or people on the political right, which is not what Bush said. Either way, they're at odds at this, and Liz Cheney is just a latest example of it.
Right, and really notable, too, to see former President Bush come out in this public way. As we know, that was not his policy to do during President's actual time in office. All right, Ed O'Keefe, Zeke Miller, and Catherine Lucey, great to have you all. Thank you very much.